Have you ever walked into a room where dozens of powerful faces sat upright in tailored suits, where a single glance was enough for them to decide you did not belong? Have you ever been pushed aside, assigned a lesser role, not because of your ability, but because of your skin color, gender, or background, even when you knew in your heart you carried ideas strong enough to change the world? That is the quiet ache of millions of people of color, seen but not recognized, present but not acknowledged, heard but never truly listened to. And yet from that pain rises a brighter fire, the hunger for justice. A world where voices aren't distorted, where truth isn't buried, and where a black CEO can step into the global boardroom, not to interpret someone else's words, but to translate the very future of humanity. And then, in the moment of what seemed like her deepest humiliation, the unexpected twist arrived. The world mistook her for a translator at someone else's command. But only minutes later, she became the sole person with the power to sign the global accord. A reversal so sharp it stripped bare the truth. Who truly held power? If you've ever been underestimated, mistaken, or dismissed, let today's story remind you, your strength doesn't come from how others see you. It comes from the moment you choose to stand tall and stay silent at the right time. Like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell. Because here on Racist Exposed, every story is not just a tale told, but a mirror held up to justice, injustice, and the quiet power within ourselves. And now, let us step into the United Nations chamber, where Monica Reed, a black CEO, has just walked in, only to be mistaken for a translator. A small error, perhaps, but one that will shake the foundations of global policy. Monica Reed entered the United Nations headquarters with steady strides. Her black dress fitted close, a long coat draped across her shoulders like a silent shield. The rhythm of her heels echoed against the vast marble floor, blending with the low murmur of voices in dozens of languages. Flags of every nation fluttered near the revolving doors. A place that claimed to stand for global equality, though Monica knew too well that equality often lived only on the blue posters outside. She handed her invitation card to security, a white man with a buzz cut. He glanced at the card, then back at her face. His stare wasn't simple verification. It carried something familiar, something Monica had seen hundreds of times before. Suspicion fed by prejudice. "Are you sure this is where you belong?" he asked, his voice half taunt, half challenge, as though it were some private joke only the powerful were allowed to laugh at. Monica didn't smile. She only nodded, her gaze cold and resolute, sharp as velvet-wrapped steel. The scanner blinked green, confirming her clearance. But instead of stepping aside, the man raised an eyebrow and signaled for another guard to double-check. At that moment, Monica felt the weight of eyes in the lobby. Suits and ties swept past, their pace brisk, but not too brisk to avoid glancing at her. Curiosity and disdain tangled in their gaze. It was the kind of look that said, "Something's wrong. Someone like her doesn't belong here." Monica stood still, hand on her leather briefcase. She knew if she argued, she'd only feed the picture of the troublemaker. So she let them drag out the so-called procedure, a clumsy performance she had watched many times before. Finally, the guard nodded her through, but not without tossing a remark. Half stern, half smug. "Make sure you don't wander into the staff area." A soft slap in the face, delivered with the kind of politeness that made the sting sharper. Monica walked through the gate, her face unreadable, but inside she was laughing, bitterly, because she knew this was only the opening act. They thought she was misplaced, but her very misplacement was about to turn the room of power ahead on its head. They thought she was the one in the wrong place. But in a few minutes, they would be the ones searching for a way back. She moved down a long hallway, chandeliers above glimmering like scattered stars. Her heart was steady, though her shoulders carried the weight of every glance cast her way. The heavy wooden doors to the main conference room opened like gates to another world. Inside, rows of delegates sat in a sweeping arc, shoulders squared, folders tucked under arms, lips pressed tight. The air carried that familiar cocktail, power and arrogance. Monica entered, eyes scanning for her assigned seat. But before she could sit, a tall man with slicked silver hair rose, a delegate from one of the wealthiest nations. His voice cut through the room cold. "Over there, do your job." In his hand, a headset, thrust at her like a command, not a question, not a moment of doubt, just the absolute certainty. The black woman in the room must be the translator. Monica looked at the headset, then at his face, blank as though he'd just cleared a table and summoned the waiter. A few others chuckled, their laughter thin and sharp as blades. No one paused to wonder what she might say. To them, this was routine. A misplaced staffer, corrected and returned to her proper role. Monica said nothing. She extended her hand, fingers closing around the headset as though handling something fragile. The room settled into its old script. Black women serve, white men decide. But if one had listened closely, they might have caught it. The dry laugh that never left Monica's lips, existing only in her chest. A bitter laugh at a world too eager to slap labels on others. She walked slowly toward the interpreter's row, each click of her heel a tick on the clock counting down. Sitting down, she adjusted the mic, slipped on the headset, and swept her gaze over those who had just mocked her. They mistook her silence for submission. But in that very silence, Monica was laying the first stone of a reversal no one could imagine. They thought she was a staffer. In minutes, they would be the ones bowing their heads to her words. She pulled the cold metal chair closer, settling in as though the role were hers. The microphone, the headset, the empty notebook, all props in a place she'd never auditioned for. The room quieted as delegates shifted back to private conversations, preparing for the session. No one paid her attention anymore. To them, the joke had run its course. She'd been put back in place, but in Monica's eyes a fire burned. It did not roar, did not flare, but smoldered hot, waiting for its moment. Like lava under a volcano, silent, but ready to burn everything once unleashed. Her hands rested on the notebook. She opened to a blank page. The pen slid across smoothly, but instead of transcribing their words, she wrote fragments of her own. Shards of justice, pieces of truth twisted out of shape. She was not preparing for translation. She was preparing for a different kind of translation. Of truth, of power, of the future itself. Up in the delegates' row, the man who had tossed her the headset leaned over, whispering to a colleague. They laughed quietly, their amusement fizzling like flat beer, already forgetting her presence. To them, she was invisible now. But invisibility was its own advantage. They never guarded against the ones they considered small. Monica knew this. She sat still, letting their arrogance wash over her like air. And in that quiet, she was already building the stage for the turn to come. Her hand brushed lightly against the microphone, an absent gesture but loaded with meaning. A reminder to herself, when I speak, they will listen. She lifted her gaze to the arc of seats, the faces, the suits, the eyes that believed they held the world in their grip. Monica didn't chase their spotlight. She let them glow, for now, because when the moment came, the only light left would be hers. They thought they had shrunk her into a shadow, but in a few minutes they would be the ones diminished in hers. Under the sterile white light cascading from the high ceiling, Monica tilted her head just slightly, and her eyes caught a familiar face among the forest of strangers. Alara Kwan, a delegate from a small nation clinging to the farthest margins of the global economy. A country that had hovered on the edge of collapse more than once, saved only by loans and trade deals Monica had quietly engineered behind the curtain. The memory flickered back. Of that day, years ago, when Kwan had clasped Monica's hand so tightly, eyes brimming with tears, as the rescue agreement was signed. Her voice had trembled with promise. I will not forget the one who saved my country. For a fleeting moment, Monica had believed gratitude could exist even in politics. And now, here they were, in this grand UN chamber, surrounded by flags and polished suits. Their eyes met across the room. For a second, the humiliation Monica had just endured eased, replaced by a fragile thread of solace. No matter what others thought, at least one person here knew who she truly was. Monica dipped her chin, lips curving into a faint smile, an ally's signal. But then Alara Kwan turned away. Not by accident, by choice. Her hands busied themselves with flipping through papers, her gaze locked on meaningless lines of text, erasing the recognition that had just sparked between them. That turn of the head was sharper than any spoken rejection. It was betrayal from the one Monica had trusted most. Inside, Monica heard something break. Not the collapse of a grand alliance, but the shattering of personal faith. Enemies betray as expected, but the betrayal of an ally, quiet, deliberate, cuts deeper. She exhaled softly, her smile thinning into a bitter curve. Here, in this hall hailed as the Temple of International Justice, everyone wore masks, and today Kwan's mask was the mask of a stranger. Monica lowered her eyes to her notebook, writing a single line. Sometimes the silence of a friend is sharper than the laughter of an enemy. To outsiders, Kwan's dismissal would look like nothing. A distracted shuffle of papers. But Monica knew better. In politics, glances are never accidental. That cold turn was no simple avoidance. It was a rejection sharper than a public decree. Monica sat still, gaze following the woman who pretended not to see her. The ache wasn't from the disdain of strangers, but from the crumbling of a bond once anchored in trust. Strange, she thought. People brace for an enemy's blow, but no one prepares for the moment a friend pretends not to notice. Kwan kept her face serene, her posture composed, her eyes buried in documents. Anyone looking would think she was simply focused on the upcoming session. But Monica caught the fleeting tremor in her lips, a flicker of fear. This was more than disavowal. It was the terror of association. One nod, one sign of recognition, and Kwan risked falling from her seat of power. Monica's thoughts turned bitter. There are betrayals that need no knives. A single averted face can kill trust just as easily. She pressed her pen again to the page. When allies turn away, enemies need not act. Each letter precise, like a blade scored into white paper. Around her chair scraped, papers rustled, whispers rose and fell. None noticed what had just passed between two women. Only Monica and Kwan felt the weight of it. But sometimes the deepest wound is not from what is said, but from what is withheld, being abandoned in full view of the crowd. Monica's eyes narrowed. She did not plead, did not chase the look already gone. Because in that instant, a truth crystallized. If allies vanish, then she has only herself. And when a person has only themselves left, they become the most dangerous weapon in the room. They thought Kwan's turn was a small detail, insignificant in this arena of power. But in minutes, they would realize that silent betrayal had armed Monica with something sharper than loyalty: clarity. Monica sat motionless, her gaze lingering on the woman who once clasped her hand with tears. Inside, she felt the hollow space where trust used to live. Yet instead of bowing her head in humiliation, her lips curved into the faintest smile. Sad, ironic, because the betrayal had confirmed what she already knew. In this room, no one truly stood with her. She reached up and slowly slid the headset back on. To the room, it looked like acceptance, the quiet compliance of a minor role. The headset pressed over her ears, filling them with the dull hum of trial audio checks. But Monica wasn't listening. Not to them. She was listening to her own silence, a silence that had become her shield. The others thought she had surrendered. They didn't know her silence was camouflage. Her smile faded. Her eyes sharpened, calm but blazing, like a furnace locked behind steel, contained until the moment it was not. She looked around, at the murmuring delegates, at the silver-haired man smirking, at Kwan still buried in her papers. They all believed Monica had stepped off the board, reduced to a harmless piece set aside. But the irony was cruel. A translator, if they choose, can alter the meaning of a room. One word shifted, and the balance of power tilts. And the one sitting in that invisible chair held the key to the game. Monica knew it, and she was ready to wield it like a knife tucked beneath her sleeve. They thought they'd shoved her into a role too small to matter. But soon, they would learn that this role was the perfect disguise, masking the most devastating reversal yet. The air in the chamber shifted slowly as the microphone flickered to life. A delegate from the wealthy bloc rose, one hand pressed on a thick stack of documents, his voice smooth, rehearsed, like silk stretched over iron. He spoke in honeyed words polished to perfection, yet beneath them lingered the metallic tang of chains. "We are willing to support." His voice rang across the hall, but hidden behind "willing to support" were shackles, clauses of debt and obligation that no poor nation could sign without tightening the noose around its own neck. Monica sat still, listening, her eyes fixed on the official interpreter. The man delivered each sentence with gentle cadence, weaving sharp-edged words into velvet. Binding terms became commitments. Debt obligations softened into opportunities for cooperation. Daggers honed to a razor edge in the original speech transformed into bouquets of silk when they passed through the interpreter's tongue. The hall nodded along. Delegates from smaller nations exhaled in relief, as if they had just heard an act of mercy. But Monica heard differently, more clearly than anyone. She heard the raw words beneath the disguise, the barbs smothered in honeyed deception. Through her headset, the translation flowed like a lullaby. This partnership will open a new era for developing economies. Yet Monica knew in the original voice the delegate was saying, "We will tighten our grip, ensuring no one escapes our control." The contrast made Monica laugh inwardly. She laughed at the sophistication of the trick, the sleight of tongue played in this chamber for decades. No weapons needed, no armies required. All it took was replacing impose with assist, force with cooperate. And just like that, justice was lawfully counterfeited. She wrote another line in her notebook. Empires rule not only with armies, but with sweetened words. Sitting there, Monica understood. Their mistake of miscasting her role was in fact her opening. When they dismiss you, they lower their guard. And no one here imagined that a second-rate translator would soon be translating the very balance of power itself. They believed language had already been bent enough to hide the truth. But in just minutes, they would hear that truth. Naked, unadorned, spoken from the chair they considered beneath notice. A young delegate from a developing nation raised his hand, his nervous voice trembling into the mic. "Could we hear the translation again?" Some terms were unclear to us. A simple request. Yet it felt like a strange pause across the chamber. Dozens of eyes shifted toward the interpreter's booth. The official interpreter hesitated, frowning, as if afraid to repeat too plainly what had been so carefully wrapped. Then, almost as a tidy solution, the silver-haired man in the front row suddenly gestured toward Monica. "Let her do it. Supplemental translation. That's her job." Chairs scraped. A few chuckled. Others nodded as if indulging in a trivial aside. Monica adjusted her headset, fingers brushing the microphone. No one in the room knew this moment would alter the rhythm of the entire session. Her voice came steady, low but resonant. The delegate just said, "We are willing to support weaker economies." But the truth in his original words was, "We intend to impose obligations to ensure they never grow strong enough to escape our control." The chamber froze. Some laughed nervously, assuming she had misspoken. Others frowned, lips pressed tight. And from the back rows, faces of small nation delegates blanched pale. Because for the first time, someone dared to speak aloud what they had always suspected but never heard declared. Monica pressed on, each phrase sharp as a blade slicing through polished lies. The word translated as commitment was, in fact, binding obligation. The phrase called opportunity for cooperation was, in truth, duty to repay debt. And what they called a new era, the original voice named permanent control. Murmurs erupted. Wealthy delegates leaned back, whispering frantically to aides, faces flushed with anger. Meanwhile, in the back rows, the overlooked nations exchanged startled glances, their eyes trembling, then glowing faintly as if hearing raw truth for the very first time. Monica set her pen down, lips curving into a thin, sardonic smile. In a room accustomed to sugar-coated words, the sudden taste of truth felt like an insult. But it was precisely that insult which roused their long-buried pride. They thought supplemental translation was a mere formality. In reality, it had ignited a confrontation that could not be undone. The chamber stiffened, heavy as carved stone. Monica's words echoed through the speakers, not soft and conciliatory like translations past, but sharp, reverberant, like warning bells. The entire hall felt slapped across the face with the very words they had tried to bury. From the front row, a silver-haired delegate slammed his palm against the desk. The crack echoed, making water glasses tremble. "Impossible! That is not what I said," he shouted. But his original voice betrayed him. Those who knew the language recognized instantly. Monica had not invented a thing. The wealthy bloc scowled in unison. To them, it was as if their magic trick had been exposed mid-performance. They were used to hiding knives behind silk cloth, and now the knife had been pulled into the open for all to see. Their fury was mixed with fear. If truth kept spilling, the entire order might fracture. In the back rows, whispers began. At first, trembling, hesitant, like a bird daring its first song in the dark. Then louder, bolder. Eyes lit with disbelief, lips curling into faint smiles. For the first time in years, they were hearing exactly what had been hidden beneath layers of rhetoric. One young delegate whispered, "So we're not crazy. We're not imagining it. It was real all along." A small sentence, but it echoed like thunder inside hearts long silenced. Monica sat calm, her hand resting on the notebook, her gaze sliding across the room. Toward the powerful, her look was a silent mockery. "You built this. Now live with it." Toward the powerless, her look was a spark, a reminder. Not all is lost. The room split sharply in two. One side flushed red, teeth clenched like rulers stripped naked before the crowd. The other sat stunned, eyes glistening with a cocktail of fear and hope. And between them, Monica remained still, serene in posture, but in truth, the pivot around which the entire hall had begun to turn. They thought the interpreter's silence was a shadow at the margins. But in minutes, that shadow would flare into a spotlight, piercing the dark corners they had hidden for decades. The tension in the chamber finally snapped when a powerful delegate shot to his feet. His chair toppled back, clattering against the desk with a sharp crack that cut through the air. Silence fell instantly. He was a familiar face, one of the wealthy bloc's enforcers, a man who had long dictated terms to smaller nations. Now his face burned crimson, his eyes bulging as though he had been insulted to the marrow. His voice pierced the chamber, shrill, metallic, scraping like steel against glass. "She's lying! She's just a black woman daring to overstep!" The words ricocheted across the hall like a signed indictment. No more masks, no more layers of subtlety. The accusation laid bare the raw prejudice beneath, the unspoken belief that a black woman could never hold the authority to define truth within these walls. A few nearby nodded slightly, their silent speaking assent. Others smirked, blades hidden in the curve of their lips, savoring Monica's public dragging. Whispers rippled, rising like a chorus to prop up his attack. Monica sat motionless. Her gaze locked on the man raging before her, steady, unblinking. Her stillness only fanned his fury. The louder he shouted, the more he betrayed his fear. It wasn't her he feared, it was the truth she had unshackled. The chamber had become a theater, replaying an old, tired script, the powerful silencing with shouts, the crowd echoing with complicity, and the victim cast as criminal. But this time, Monica refused her cue. She did not plead, she did not protest. She let the accusation stand, naked, collapsing under the weight of its own absurdity. She knew the true danger wasn't in the scream, It was in the soft laughter, the approving nods, the way a hall full of nations was willing to cling to humiliation rather than Fum's truth. Monica tilted her head slightly as if watching a poorly staged comedy. A fleeting smile touched her lips, not the smile of surrender, but of someone who already knows how the play ends. They believed shaming her publicly would brand her a liar, but in minutes, those very words would become evidence, stripping the mask off the entire system. After his screeching charge, the hall erupted like a chamber filled with poison gas. Laughter flared, not joyous, but sharp, empty, spreading like oil across water. It wasn't laughter at humor, it was laughter as domination. A few delegates banged their desks, not to applaud, but to pound rhythm for the chorus of ridicule. "Throw her out!" one voice shouted. Another chimed in instantly. "This is the United Nations, not a stage for her theatrics." The noise hammered down, row by row, striking ears like blows. The powerful bloc reveled, delighted they had turned Monica into the lightning rod of scorn. The weaker bloc sat frozen, eyes downcast, afraid even a flicker of sympathy might brand them targets too. Monica remained still, her hands resting neatly on her notebook, her face unreadable. To her, their shouts sounded no different from children making noise in a classroom. Loud, unruly, masking their own insecurity. If they were certain she was wrong, they wouldn't need to scream. The chamber had turned into a courtroom without a judge, but filled with invisible jurors. Monica's supposed crime wasn't lying, as they claimed. It was daring to speak the truth in her own voice. For a brief second, her eyes met those of a young delegate seated in the back. He quickly lowered his gaze, but not before she caught the flicker of confusion. An unspoken admission that even amidst this chorus of condemnation, someone still recognized where truth lay. Monica inclined her head slightly, listening as if to a dissonant orchestra. The laughter, the desk banging, the cries to expel, all melded into a grotesque kind of music. And within her, a bitter smile bloomed. So this was how international justice operated, beating to the rhythm of a rowdy tavern. They thought the jeers and the shouting would crush her. But in minutes, that chaos would turn back on them, exposing the true faces of those who had laughed the loudest. The jeers echoed, then began to fade. Not from satisfaction, but from the creeping weight of realization. Monica hadn't reacted. Not a word of defense, not a cry of anger. She sat upright, hands folded on her notebook, eyes fixed ahead. Her gaze was neither pleading nor enraged. It was calm, crystalline, so heavy that each insult suddenly sounded hollow. One delegate leaned forward, ready to hurl another barb. But when his eyes met hers, his throat closed. There was no aggression in her stare, only stillness. So steady it became a mirror, forcing him to see the absurdity of his own performance. The atmosphere shifted. The earlier frenzy decayed into a prickling silence. People coughed, shifted in their seats, uneasy, as if caught in a sudden spotlight with nowhere to hide. Monica remained silent, and that silence became the sharpest blade. With every moment she withheld words, the accusations shrank into meaningless echoes, stones thrown into a bottomless well, vanishing without answer. In that instant, she no longer resembled a miscast interpreter. She looked like a judge seated high above, watching the mob condemn themselves with their crude laughter. A faint smile ghosted her lips. No one could tell if it was irony or defiance. But the ambiguity only thickened the air, making the powerful suddenly feel small. For her composure was itself a declaration. She needed no shouting to be heard, no defense to be right. The room inverted. What began as a spectacle of ridicule turned on itself. The laughers grew uneasy. The mocked woman quietly commanded the stage. They thought her silence meant submission, a shadow absorbing abuse. But in minutes, that silence would turn into the sharpest blade of all, cleaving through every mask that cloaked this hall. The chamber began to unravel. Chairs scraped against the floor. Whispers flared like hidden fire spreading through dry grass. A few tried pounding their desks to recover momentum, but none dared shout as boldly as before. The noise no longer carried authority. It sounded instead like the panicked thrashing of someone cornered. Amid the disorder, Monica reached for her microphone. Many expected her to rebut, to defend herself, to plead at least for her right to sit in the room. Instead, she calmly pushed the microphone aside and placed it down on the table. The faint metallic click rang out, dry and sharp, like the final knock that ends a clumsy performance. She clasped her hands together, sat upright, eyes forward. No explanation, no reaction, absolute silence. And in that instant, silence became the loudest sound in the room. For when someone refuses to argue, refuses to be dragged into the mob's frenzy, they suddenly rise above it all, where every scream below shrinks into static. Delegates nearby shifted uncomfortably. Their own noise had been swallowed whole by Monica's stillness. The irony was brutal. They had meant to make her the spectacle, yet now they looked like noisy extras in a play no one cared to watch. Monica sat steady, her gaze calm as a still lake, yet beneath it surged the weight of an unseen current. Her eyes held neither submission nor fury, only the quiet certainty that she did not need to fight for the truth. Truth was already there, waiting to be seen. The silence stretched, exposing everyone. Their triumphant laughter now seemed hollow, naked, ridiculous against the stillness pressing down on them. Monica tilted her head slightly, a small gesture showing she heard everything, saw everything, yet chose not to bow to it. That was the cruelest irony. She didn't need to respond to make them choke on their own words. They thought silence would erase her from the board. But within minutes, this silence would cut like shears, severing the rope of deception binding the chamber. The quiet thickened, tangible as smoke. Those closest to her began fidgeting. Someone coughed, a sound that rang too sharply, then stopped short as the offender realized how out of place it was. A wealthy delegate tried to break the weight. Clearing his throat, he forced a laugh. "We can't let a minor employee disrupt this assembly." But the words fell flat, sinking like a stone tossed into a swamp. No ripple, no response. Another voice broke in, hurried, almost desperate. Who gave her permission to speak on her own? This is an insult to the entire United Nations. The outburst should have drawn applause. Instead, it earned only a few half-hearted nods. Most in the room no longer knew whether they were witnessing an error or watching a truth being laid bare. While they scrambled to fill the void with words, Monica remained still, her fingers interlaced, her gaze sweeping the chamber. Not fierce, but reflective, like a mirror showing each speaker the weakness in their own posture. Patience in the hall frayed. Whispers rose and fell like flocks of startled birds unsure where to fly. Each accusation thrown became another cut, not into Monica, but into the speaker's own credibility. She remained untouched, like someone bored by a tired play being performed for the 100th time. Monica needed no defense. Her composure suffocated the room. The more they spoke, the more foolish they looked. The harder they attacked, the more helpless they appeared. And within that spiral, silence became absolute power. At last, a young delegate blurted out, "Why isn't she saying anything?" It sounded less like a question than a confession, that they had lost control. For with nothing but silence, Monica had turned their voices into a discordant chorus. They thought silence was empty space they could fill at will. But within minutes, that same silence would become a magnifying glass, exposing the weakness of a hall that claimed power. The pause grew into an invisible curtain blanketing the chamber. At first, it seemed like a brief interruption, but as it dragged on, it pressed heavier on every chest, forcing shallow breaths, restless movements, as if to hide the embarrassment spreading across the room. Those who had laughed now sat stiff-backed, pretending to study their notes, their trembling hands betraying their unease. Some bent toward aides, muttering nonsense just to mask the truth, that no one wanted to hear them anymore. Monica stayed silent, hands clasped, eyes unblinking. She didn't need to speak. Her stillness placed the entire chamber under a spotlight. Each person wondered, what is she thinking? What will she do next? And the waiting itself, paradoxically, turned the crowd from rulers into anxious spectators. There is a strange power in prolonged silence. It feels like the pause before a storm, when wind dies, birds vanish, and the earth seems to hold its breath. Everyone knew something was coming, and it would not resemble anything they had seen before. An old delegate cleared his throat, trying to puncture the tension. The sound rang hollow, like a creaking chair in an empty theater. No reply. No follow-up. And in that lonely echo, even he fell quiet. Monica tilted her head, a faint smile flickering, so slight yet sharp as irony. A smile that seemed to say, "You can shout as loud as you like, but in the end, silence keeps the rhythm." The pause stretched taut, like a violin string pulled near breaking. Everyone knew the faintest touch would send it screaming. And Monica was preparing for that touch. They thought silence was a safe void, where storms would never reach. But within minutes, this silence would explode, tearing down the walls of power they had spent years constructing. The silence hung heavy as stone, until Monica leaned forward. A simple motion, but in an air stretched so thin it threatened to snap. It struck like the first signal of an upheaval. Her fingers brushed the leather case set neatly beside her chair. It was dark brown, plain, free of polish or markings. To anyone else it was ordinary, meant for papers, pens, and little else. But when Monica placed her hand on it, every eye in the chamber followed, as if that case might hold the very thing capable of shifting the balance. She unclasped the lock. Click. The sound rang dry and crisp, a small crack splitting the thick silence. To the room it struck like a gavel on wood, the start of judgment. Eyes fixed on Monica. No more whispers, no more rustling. Pages stopped mid-turn. Even breath seemed suspended, the entire hall waiting to see what lived inside the case. The silver-haired delegate, the first to humiliate Monica, frowned, forcing a smirk, though his hand clenched his pen. Deep down, he too sensed something was slipping beyond his grasp. Monica opened the case slowly, like a ritual. She didn't look down at papers. Her gaze swept forward at the stiff faces arrayed before her. In that moment, she was no longer a woman relegated to the translator's row. She was a director, lifting the curtain on the scene that would define the play. No one knew what the case held, yet everyone felt it mattered more than any speech that had been read. Monica's composure alone transformed an ordinary case into a black box of dangerous secrets. Someone whispered, "What is she doing?" A small question, but it reverberated across the room. Everyone wanted to know. No one dared admit the fear rising inside them. Monica lowered her eyes, fingers gliding over the edges of the documents within. A faint smile flickered at her lips. Not joy, but mockery thrown at the entire room. You wanted me invisible, and yet here you are holding your breath for what I will reveal. They thought the case held harmless papers, but within minutes it would overturn the balance of power in this hall. She reached inside and touched a thick dossier leather-bound with gold edges. Her movements were deliberate, drawing out the suspense. Every gaze locked to her hand, every breath caught in their throats. No coughs, no shuffling chairs, only anticipation stretched thin as wire. She drew out a document. Light from above gleamed on the bold red seal, sharp and unmistakable. The words beneath seared into the eyes of the assembly. Monica Reed, Chairwoman, Global Trade Council. The air split in two. Those who mocked her minutes ago now sat frozen, eyes wide, lips trembling. They stared at the document as if it were a blade unsheathed at their table. The silver-haired delegate, the one who had tossed her the headset, blinked rapidly. The smirk on his lips fell heavy. He tried to laugh, but the sound died in his throat, replaced by a bitter swallow. Others bent to whisper at their aides, desperate to move, to act. But no words could undo what stood before them. The paper was no rumor, no trick. It bore the seal of an institution larger than any of them. And it bore Monica's name. She set the document on the table with precision, then raised her head. Her gaze swept the room, unhurried, but sharp enough that many flinched and looked away. She didn't need to shout or slam her hand against the table. With one sheet of paper, she had dragged the chamber from arrogance to unease. Her eyes carried an edge of irony, as if saying without words, "You gave me a headset, but I am the one who holds the pen over the agreement you all must sign." The air grew dense. Heavy breaths filled the space. The truth had been laid bare. The woman they mistook for a faceless interpreter was the very one holding the scales of global trade. They thought the case carried scraps, but now this document would force them all to bow their heads to Monica. Laughter was gone. Not faded. Gone. Cut clean, like a switch flipped. The hall that buzzed minutes ago became a cavern. The only sounds the shallow gasps and the nervous rustle of paper between trembling fingers. Faces once radiant with mocking smiles stiffened, twisted. Shame wrestled with anger, with silence. None dared meet Monica's eyes, for in them lived something sharper than accusation, undeniable truth. She sat tall, hands resting calmly beside the document stamped in red. She didn't need to raise it, didn't need to explain. Its presence alone bent the room. This was no debate, no exchange of words. This was power signed in ink, and whether they liked it or not, they had to accept it. The silver-haired delegate sat hollow, his face drained. His eyes darted like a trapped animal searching for escape. He couldn't look at the document, nor at the woman he had belittled. Minutes ago, he thought he'd triumphed with public humiliation. Now he was the most humiliated of all. No one spoke. The silence pressed so hard that even the ticking clock on the wall sounded like a war drum. Every second was another slap, reminding them of their mistake. Monica let the silence linger, like an artist holding the final note, leaving her audience breathless. A thin smile curved her lips, not pride, but irony at the absurdity. How strange this world is. The interpreter you dismissed is the one writing the final lines of the document you must all sign. A brutal twist. Every ounce of power, arrogance, and scorn had been crushed by one piece of paper on the table. They thought Monica was a shadow at the margins, sitting in the wrong seat. But soon enough, they would realize. She was the figure casting the shadow, and they were the ones trembling in her light. Monica placed her hand on the microphone and drew it closer, slow and deliberate. The motion echoed through the chamber, small yet resounding, like the first breath before an entirely new symphony begins. Every eye followed, no one daring to interrupt. She lifted her head. Her voice, low and steady, filled the hall. Not loud, but deep enough to reach every corner. Then, allow me to translate one last time. Faces flinched. The words calm on the surface carried a blade of irony beneath. A translator once ordered to obey was now choosing her own language. That opening line felt less like an announcement, more like the quiet draw of a knife before the strike. Monica never glanced at notes, never scribbled. Every word lived in her memory, carved there long before. And in truth, she wasn't translating for anyone. She was translating truth for the world. Her cadence was firm, each word deliberate. What you call commitment is not goodwill, it is bondage. What you call assistance is not support, it is imposition. And what you call a new era is nothing but chains plated in gold. The words cut clean. No embellishment, no disguise. They tore straight through the gauzy veil that great powers had wrapped around their designs, exposing the bones beneath. Each syllable slashed open the velvet curtain to reveal the rotting frame behind it. Someone shifted, lips parting to object. But Monica's voice overrode, not because it was louder, but because it was stronger. She didn't shout, didn't impose. Her stillness alone made resistance hollow. Delegates from smaller nations sat transfixed. Their eyes widened, breath caught, as if at last they saw their own reflection spoken aloud. Monica's language was no longer the tongue of power. It was the language of the truth they had carried silently for years. She paused, letting silence seep into the cracks, then spoke again, voice dropping deeper. You are accustomed to sugar-coated translations, but today you will hear the original, unaltered, unsoftened. The chamber tightened. The game of concealment was finished. They thought Monica was merely the mouthpiece for their will. But within minutes, they would realize she had become the voice none of them could control. Leaning closer to the mic, she carved her words into the air. The clause called mandatory financial commitment. I translate it as this. Wealthy nations will share resources to ensure fair development. A ripple stirred. Wealthy delegates stiffened, color draining from their faces. Monica pressed on. Her tone was calm, steady, as if she were reading a manifesto inscribed in her soul long ago. The clause called opportunity for cooperation. I translate it as this. Smaller nations hold the right to choose partners, and the right to refuse when terms are unjust. In the back rows, faces lit up. Eyes blinked fast, brimming with disbelief and hope. They had heard these words before, but never like this. Not shackles and velvet, but freedom spoken plainly. Monica's voice carried on. The clause called a new era of partnership. I translate it as this. No nation shall be forced into debt as the price of its survival. Each sentence, though courteous, sliced sharp through their carefully engineered rhetoric. These were no translations anymore. They were verdicts. Not the voice of an interpreter, but the judgment of the one with the final signature. The powerful faltered. Some pushed back their chairs as if to rise in protest, but froze, for they knew in front of dozens of others, any reaction would expose their greed. Meanwhile, the weaker states whispered, then nodded, then stared at one another with eyes shimmering in agreement. Monica ignored the rustle. She bent, touched the red-sealed document, and declared, This is the final translation, and this will be the final clause. No one dared exhale. The words rang not as opinion, but as decree. Unmovable. In that moment, Monica was no longer the woman mistaken for an interpreter. She was rewriting the game itself, and the room, like it or not, had no choice but to follow. They once thought translation was harmless, neutral. But within minutes, this translation would become binding text, stronger than any signature already on paper. When Monica fell silent, the air in the hall was so tight they could hear the beating of their own hearts. Then, like a hidden door swinging open, a clap rose from the back. Tentative, almost guilty. Then another, and another, until an entire row of small nations rose to their feet. They clapped not for performance, but for release. For truth finally spoken aloud. The applause swelled, wave after wave, crashing against the chamber walls that had once contained only cold silence. Up front, where the powerful sat, silence reigned. Their hands stayed frozen on the tables, nailed in place. The smirks were gone. What remained was rage smothered under shame. The silver-haired delegate who once tossed her the headset now stared blankly at meaningless lines of text. He couldn't lift his eyes, for in every glance he would see his humiliation mirrored back. Monica did not rise, did not bask. She raised no fist, claimed no victory. She sat steady, hands flat on the table, letting the applause surge on its own, an orchestra without a conductor. And that calmness gave the sound more force, transforming it into a declaration none could ignore. The truth was laid bare. No matter their anger, they could not refute it. For the final authority, the power to sign, the power to seal, rested in Monica's hands. Every person who once mocked her now had to listen, not because they wished to, but because they had no other choice. A faint smile touched Monica's lips, not of triumph, but of bitter irony. Those who believed themselves untouchable now bowed before the very translator they had dismissed. They thought applause or silence could sway the game. But soon they would understand. The only act that mattered was the signature. And that signature belonged to Monica Reed alone. The conference door shut behind Monica with a dry, final click. Inside, the echoes of applause still lingered, tangled with the heavy silence of power stripped bare. But outside, the long corridor stretched forward, carpeted in deep green, as if it led to a different world. One without sneers, without probing eyes. Monica walked calmly, shoulders square, stride steady. Her face betrayed no trace of triumph. Instead, there was the quiet composure of someone who had lit a fire and left it to burn inside others. Each step resounded like the distant beat of a drum, a reminder that what had just happened in that chamber was not an end, but the beginning. Diplomats passed by, some lifting their heads, some pausing mid-step. A few recognized her, others did not, but all shared the same reaction, their eyes drawn, almost unwillingly, to her presence. Tall, resolute, clothed in a simple yet regal black dress. It was not the image of a translator. It was the image of someone who had forced the world to fall silent and listen. Light spilled through the tall glass panes, striping the carpet with long beams. As Monica moved, her shadow stretched across the floor like a dark brushstroke, bold and unerasable. Something in her bearing compelled even strangers to halt for a second, a strange fusion of power and stillness, of strength carried in silence. Behind those doors, delegates were still shouting, scrambling to salvage face. But Monica did not look back. She knew they could argue until dawn, but the document was already in her hands. And her words, framed as a final translation, had become the skeleton of a new accord. She did not need to shout. She did not need to raise a fist. All she had to do was stand, speak clearly, and leave. Simple, cold, and far more enduring than any debate. A young staffer carrying a stack of files stopped short, staring after her. He didn't understand all that had transpired, but awe flickered in his eyes. To him, Monica seemed less like a woman leaving a meeting than a warrior leaving a battlefield. Without a wound, yet behind her lay countless defeated. They thought her exit meant power would return to them. But in minutes, they would realize it was her calm, retreating figure that remained, etched deeper than any word. Inside, the chamber exploded. Chairs scraped, fists slammed, voices clashed in chaos. Gone was the staged composure of a global summit. What remained was a marketplace of humiliation, powerful men and women clawing to speak last. Some shouted that the text was invalid, that the interpreter had overstepped. But their rage rang hollow, like puppets jerking long after their strings had snapped. Others slumped in despair, thumbing through documents, whispering regrets they should have acted sooner. Too late. No one could rewind to the moment Monica leaned into the microphone and said, "One last translation." Then through the din, a young female voice cut clean. "We've been silent too long. She only spoke what we all knew." Not loud, yet sharp as a blade through the air. Faces turned, some startled, some ashamed. For the truth was dawning. It wasn't Monica who had gone too far. It was their silence that had enabled injustice. A senior delegate, once loudest against her, now gripped his pen until his knuckles whitened. He no longer shouted. He understood. Denial only made her truth heavier. In one corner, representatives of small nations whispered, not in fear this time, but in strategy. For the first time, they saw an opening, a chance for fairness, a document reshaped, a door cracked in the fortress of power. The chamber, built for civil dialogue, now roared like a marketplace. The mighty scrambled to cover shame. The weak lifted their heads, and through it all one image remained. The black woman, once dismissed as a translator, leaving with steady grace. They thought chaos would bury her moment. But soon that moment would be the only thing retold in the corridors, an unhealable fracture no argument could plaster over. The story spread without journalists. It moved in hurried footsteps, in whispers at coffee machines, in glances exchanged along green-carpeted halls. Within minutes, the UN tower buzzed with one tale. A black interpreter stood up, rewrote the words, and left the chamber silent. Some said she dismantled power with just a smile. Others exaggerated. Her words were blades turning giants into jesters. Still others swore she alone held the final key to the agreement. Whatever the version, all agreed on one truth. No one left that room the same. Feet shuffled on spiral staircases, clusters gathered at tall windows. Everywhere voices circled back to her. Beyond the glass, flags snapped in the wind, and the air itself felt changed, as if a crack had opened in a wall once thought immovable. One man laughed bitterly. For years we let them define justice. And then a woman, mistaken as out of place, reminded us what justice really is. No one answered, but many eyes darkened. Because the truth wasn't only about today, it cast a heavier question. How many other truths, how many other chances, how many other lives had been erased by the narrow judgment of skin, of origin, of where someone was allowed to sit? And in that silence, a voice lingered like an aftershock. How many truths have been silenced simply because someone mistook the worth of a life by the color of its skin? It demanded no reply. It left a wound echoing long after the hall had emptied. They thought tomorrow everything would return to normal. But in minutes, they would see. No one could sit in their chair without hearing that voice again, low and steady, translating not their words, but their indictment. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.